In a packed Texas courtroom, the judge froze mid-sentence. His gavel trembled in his hand. A voice, clear, commanding, yet gentle, echoed deep inside his heart. I'm her lawyer. And from that moment, nothing in that courtroom would ever be the same again. The sound of the ceiling fan hummed above courtroom 7 of the Bexar County Civil Court. Friday morning sunlight cut through the blinds, striping the faces of lawyers, clerks, and spectators who'd come to watch what everyone assumed would be a routine eviction case. On one side of the room sat Martin Vale, the powerful CEO of Lone Star Central Bank, flanked by 3 attorneys in matching gray suits. Their table gleamed with leather briefcases, laptops, and perfectly stacked documents. Across from them, alone at the defense table, sat Grace Alvarez, a 58-year-old widow in a faded black dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a worn folder. Her son Michael, 16, and her daughter Ellie, 14, sat in the first row behind her, silent, scared, but trying to look brave for their mother. The clerk called the case. Lone Star Central Bank versus Grace Alvarez. Judge Raymond Archer, a man known for his strict professionalism and unbending adherence to the law, adjusted his glasses. He'd seen hundreds of cases like this one. Banks against people with overdue mortgages. To him, it was another day, another ruling. The lead attorney, Daniel Shaw, stood confidently. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, this is a straightforward matter of delinquent payment. The defendant, Mrs. Alvarez, has failed to meet the final obligations of her mortgage. The bank is within its rights to reclaim the property. Grace lifted her head slightly. Her lips moved, but no words came. Shaw clicked a button, and a large screen came to life, showing charts, signatures, and transaction dates. Everything designed to make her look irresponsible. Every fact looked coldly official. Every number screamed guilty. Judge Archer turned to Grace. Mrs. Alvarez, he said in a steady tone, do you have any legal representation today? No, Your Honor, she answered softly. I couldn't afford one. The judge sighed. Then you'll need to speak for yourself. Grace stood up. Her voice quivered. My husband paid that house in full before he died. I saw the receipt with my own eyes. I kept it safe. But now it's gone. Someone must have erased it, or... Her voice trailed off as Daniel Shaw interrupted. Objection, Your Honor. That's hearsay and speculation. The gavel struck once. Sustained, said the judge. Mrs. Alvarez, do you have any proof of payment? Her silence filled the room. Even the ticking of the courtroom clock grew loud. Finally, Grace whispered, No, sir, but I have my faith. A low chuckle came from the bank's table. Martin Vale smirked. To him, faith was no evidence. To everyone else in the room, the case was already over. But Grace did something no one expected. She walked around the table, knelt on the cold courtroom floor, and raised her trembling hands toward heaven. Her voice broke through the silence. Lord Jesus Christ, if I have no lawyer on earth, be my lawyer in heaven. If I have no witness that men can see, be my witness. Every eye in the room froze. The security guard near the door stopped breathing for a moment. Even the air felt charged with something unseen. Judge Archer's fingers gripped the edge of his bench. His heart pounded in his chest. Then, it happened. A whisper, yet louder than thunder, resonated within him. I'm her lawyer. The judge's face turned pale. His pen dropped. For the first time in 30 years of service, his logic failed him. Someone was in that courtroom. Court will take a 30-minute recess, he announced, voice trembling. The gavel struck once, echoing like a heartbeat through the chamber. No one understood what had just happened, but deep inside that Texas courtroom, the judge of heaven had just entered the case. The day the eviction notice arrived, San Antonio was wrapped in the quiet heat of an early Texas morning. The air smelled faintly of dust and fabric softener inside the Alvarez home, where Grace sat at her sewing table, mending a denim jacket under the thin hum of her old Singer machine. For years, this modest house had been her world, its pale yellow walls carrying the laughter, prayers, and memories of the family she built with Alberto, her late husband. The knock on the door was soft but sharp enough to stop the rhythm of her stitching. A courier in a crisp blue shirt handed her an envelope stamped Lone Star Central Bank. He didn't wait for a signature. He turned and left before she could ask anything. Grace's fingers hesitated on the flap, a strange heaviness filling her chest. Inside was a single page that made her world tilt, the official notice of foreclosure. Her breath caught. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. The words looked official, merciless. The bank claimed she still owed 2 payments on a mortgage she and Alberto had finished years ago. Her mind raced back to the night her husband had walked through that very door, pale but smiling, waving a stamped receipt. "It's done, Grace. Paid in full. This house is ours." Now, 2 years after his death, that promise had turned to ash. She sat on the front steps, staring at the paper as if it might rewrite itself. The sound of the screen door creaking open broke her trance. Michael, her teenage son, tall and lean from working part-time at a local grocery store, stepped out. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked. Behind him, Ellie, 14, clutched a school book to her chest. Grace handed Michael the notice. His eyes scanned the page, disbelief flashing across his young face. "This can't be real," he said, voice trembling. "Dad showed me the receipt." "You said he—" "I know," she interrupted softly. "I saw it too." Her words hung in the warm air, fragile and helpless. Inside, the house was neat but humble. Handmade curtains, a wooden crucifix above the kitchen door, photos of Alberto smiling despite the sickness that had taken him. He had worked as a truck mechanic, saving every dollar to pay off that mortgage before his body failed. He'd promised his family they would never face eviction, no matter what happened to him. That night, Grace pulled out the old tin box where she kept every important document: tax records, utility bills, insurance papers, and most importantly, the mortgage receipts. She searched for hours, methodically, desperately. Every folder was there. Every receipt accounted for, except the last one. It was gone. She stayed up until dawn, flipping through every stack of paper, every drawer, even the pages of Alberto's worn Bible. But the proof, the one sheet of paper that could save her home, had vanished. Morning light spilled through the window when Michael found her still sitting at the table. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Mom, maybe the bank has a copy," he suggested. "Dad said they keep everything." So Grace dressed in her best black dress, the one she'd worn to Alberto's funeral, and walked the 8 blocks to the Lone Star Central Bank. The marble floors gleamed under her shoes. Employees in tailored suits passed by without meeting her eyes. At the reception desk, a woman with perfect nails and a practiced smile asked, "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Grace replied, clutching the notice. "But this is urgent. My husband paid our home in full before he died. There must be a mistake in your records." The receptionist sighed. "If you received a foreclosure notice, ma'am, it means the system shows unpaid balance. There's nothing I can do." Grace's heart pounded. "But your system is wrong," she pleaded. "Please, just check again." The woman's tone hardened. "Without proof of payment, there's nothing to discuss." Humiliation burned through Grace's chest. She turned away as whispers from nearby desks followed her to the door. Outside, the Texas sun was merciless. She pressed the notice against her chest and walked home, fighting tears. That night, in the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, she sat alone at the kitchen table. Bills, receipts, and faded photos of Alberto lay scattered around her like fragments of a life she was losing piece by piece. Her children slept in the next room. She folded her hands and stared at the small wooden cross on the wall. "Lord Jesus," she whispered, her voice cracking, "if the world's justice has forgotten us, please remember me." And in that silence, faith was all she had left. The night the proof disappeared, the Alvarez house felt heavier than ever. A thunderstorm rolled over San Antonio, lightning flashing through the thin curtains as Grace sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by folders and papers. Every document she and Alberto had kept for 30 years was laid out. Mortgage statements, utility receipts, tax letters, all perfectly labeled and filed in her husband's careful handwriting. Yet the single paper that mattered most, the one stamped "paid in full," was missing. She opened the old metal box again, the one Alberto used to call "our safe in the storm." Its hinges squeaked in protest as she rummaged through its contents: yellowed envelopes, clipped bills, photocopies of old IDs. Her hands trembled. It was right here, she muttered, half to herself, half to the man who wasn't there to answer. From the hallway, Michael appeared, his hair messy, eyes wide with worry. "You're still looking, Mom." "There has to be an explanation," she said, spreading papers across the table. "I saw it. The bank seal, Alberto's signature, the date, everything. He showed it to me the week before he died." Ellie, barefoot and sleepy, joined them, clutching a pillow. "Maybe it fell somewhere. Maybe it's inside another folder." Together they searched the entire house. Drawers, boxes, even the hollow behind the refrigerator where Alberto sometimes hid cash. Hours passed. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, but the storm inside the house only grew stronger. When Michael finally slumped into a chair, he whispered, "Mom, maybe Dad put it somewhere else. Like on his computer?" Grace froze. Of course. Alberto had learned basic computer skills near the end, scanning receipts to keep a backup just in case. She hadn't turned on his old desktop since the day he died. Michael wiped dust from the monitor and pressed the power button. The machine groaned awake, its startup chime echoing in the quiet house. Grace stood behind him, her hands clasped tight, whispering a prayer. Folder by folder, they searched. Mortgage 2019. Receipts. Insurance. Nothing. No file named final payment. No scan of the document. Just silence and a growing dread. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "He saved everything. He was so careful." Michael leaned closer to the screen. "Wait, what's this?" He opened a folder marked Bank Archive. Inside were dozens of scanned payments, every monthly statement neatly arranged, except the final one. "It's not here," he whispered. "It's like it never existed." Ellie's voice trembled. "Mom, what if someone deleted it?" Grace looked at her daughter's tearful eyes. "Who would do that, sweetheart?" she asked gently. But deep inside, a cold thought crept in. What if the bank did? The old clock in the living room ticked past midnight. The house smelled of wet earth and candle wax. Grace sat back down, defeated. Her husband's handwriting stared up at her from old receipts. Numbers, signatures, and tiny notes like, "Last one soon." She picked up his final notebook, flipping to the last page. There, written in his faint, trembling hand, was a single line. May 15th, final payment confirmed. God is good. Her fingers brushed the ink as tears blurred her vision. That sentence was all she had left of his promise. Michael turned off the computer. "We'll go to the bank tomorrow," he said softly. "We'll ask for their copy. They have to keep records, right?" Grace nodded, but her eyes were distant. She'd seen how the bank treated her the day before. Cold, mechanical, merciless. To them, faith was weakness, and truth without paper didn't exist. The storm outside faded into silence. Only the rhythmic dripping of rain echoed through the house. Grace sat alone for a moment longer, staring at the empty space in the folder where the proof should have been. She whispered into the quiet, "Lord Jesus, if men can make truth disappear, please don't let my faith vanish with it." Somewhere in that dark kitchen, between the sound of the rain and her prayer, she felt it, the faintest warmth, like a hand resting on her shoulder. It didn't bring the document back, but it brought something else, the quiet conviction that she was not searching alone. The next morning, the sky over downtown San Antonio was a flat, gray sheet. Grace Alvarez stood outside Lone Star Central Bank, her thin black dress fluttering in the wind from passing cars. She clutched a worn folder to her chest, the same one she had searched through all night, and whispered a quiet prayer before stepping inside. The air in the lobby was cold and sterile. Polished marble floors reflected the fluorescent lights, and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the faint hum of printers. Customers in pressed suits talked softly into phones, their voices echoing off the high ceiling. Grace's footsteps sounded too loud, too small. At the reception desk sat a young woman with perfect eyeliner and a badge that read Amber Client Services. She didn't look up until Grace cleared her throat. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Grace placed the foreclosure notice on the counter. "I believe there's been a mistake," she began. "My husband, Alberto Alvarez, paid off our mortgage before he passed. I just need someone to check the records, please. Amber glanced at the document and sighed. If you received this letter, ma'am, that means our system shows a balance due. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do here. You'll need to contact the legal department. I've been a customer for 20 years, Grace said, her voice trembling. Please, just look again. He paid it in full. I even had the receipt once, but now it's gone. Amber's tone stayed polite but distant. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but without proof, we can't make changes. The computer shows a balance, so legally the foreclosure will proceed. Grace blinked back tears. Are you saying the computer is more trusted than me? Than my husband's word? Amber gave a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Our system doesn't make mistakes. Grace turned away, heart pounding. Behind her, two men in suits passed by, whispering. Another one losing her house, one of them murmured. She didn't turn around, but the words stung like a blade. Upstairs, in an office lined with glass walls and trophies for top lending performance, Martin Vale, the CEO, leaned over a report. His assistant entered quietly. Sir, there's a Mrs. Alvarez downstairs insisting her loan was paid off. Vale didn't even look up. Tell legal to handle it. If there's no paperwork, it didn't happen. But she says her husband is dead. Exactly, Vale cut in, closing the file. No receipt, no record. That's how it works. We follow policy, not sympathy. In another corner of the building, a mid-level clerk named Ernest Ramirez overheard the conversation. He froze. He remembered Alberto Alvarez. Quiet, polite, always on time. Ernest had processed that final payment years ago. He could still picture Alberto's tired smile when he said, finally done. Amigo? But the digital file, it had vanished from the archives after a system update. Ramirez had reported it once, but the case was closed before anyone followed up. Now, seeing Grace at the front desk, Ernest's stomach twisted. He wanted to help her, to say something, but fear kept his mouth shut. People who questioned Martin Vale didn't last long at the bank. Back in the lobby, Grace walked out under the hard Texas sun. Her hands were shaking, her throat dry. On the sidewalk, she stopped and looked up at the towering glass building. To her, it no longer looked like a place of trust. It looked like a fortress of numbers and signatures, soulless and impenetrable. As she crossed the street, Michael caught up to her. What did they say, Mom? He asked, out of breath. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at the paper in her hands, now crumpled and damp with sweat. They said the computer doesn't make mistakes, she whispered. Michael's jaw clenched. But people do. That night, Grace sat by the window, watching the lights from downtown flicker against the clouds. Somewhere out there, men in suits were celebrating profits built on broken homes. She pressed her palms together and whispered, Lord Jesus Christ, how can truth disappear in a world that worships machines? And though no answer came yet, the silence seemed to listen. The system had dismissed her, but heaven had not. That night, the wind off the San Antonio River carried a damp chill through the narrow streets of the Alvarez neighborhood. The house stood quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the ceiling fan. Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, her Bible open. The foreclosure notice beside it like a wound that wouldn't close. The paper's black ink glared under the dim yellow light. The children had gone to bed hours ago. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing his work uniform. Ellie had curled up beside her worn-out teddy bear, whispering prayers she barely understood. But Grace couldn't rest. The words she had heard at the bank, "The system doesn't make mistakes," echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. She rose from the chair and paced the small kitchen. Every corner of the room told the story of her family. The handmade curtains Alberto had hung himself, the wall clock that ticked 5 minutes slow, the framed photo of their wedding day. Two young faces filled with hope. He had been her protector, her rock. And now, with him gone, she felt like a leaf caught in a storm of rules and screens and signatures. She whispered into the empty air, Lord, how can I fight them alone? Her voice trembled. They have lawyers, computers, money. All I have is this home. And you. The clock struck midnight. A soft rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Grace knelt beside her chair, folding her hands tightly. For a long time she said nothing. Only her breathing filled the silence. Then, with eyes shut and tears spilling down her cheeks, she began to speak, not with rehearsed words, but with the raw cry of a woman who had reached the end of herself. "Jesus, be my lawyer," she whispered. "If no one on this earth will defend me, please, defend me in heaven. You know the truth. You saw him pay. You saw how he worked until his last breath to give us this home." Her tears fell on the pages of the Bible, smudging the ink. The verse before her eyes blurred. "He defends the cause of the widow and the orphan." She clung to it as if it were a verdict written just for her. Upstairs, Ellie stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly. In her dream, she saw her father, standing in light. "Tell Mom not to give up," he said. "She's not alone." In the living room, Michael woke briefly to the sound of his mother's voice. He saw her kneeling, shoulders shaking, whispering into the air as though someone invisible sat across from her. He didn't interrupt. Something about the moment felt sacred. He bowed his head, closed his eyes, and joined her silently. Outside, the storm drew closer. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating the crucifix hanging on the wall. For a fleeting second, the shadow of the cross stretched across Grace's face, and it looked as if someone stood behind her, hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her prayer grew stronger. "Lord Jesus Christ," she said through tears, "if men erase my proof, write your truth where no one can delete it. If their laws reject me, let yours stand higher. You are my advocate, my witness, my judge. I trust you." A stillness followed, so deep it felt alive. The air grew heavy, warm, and full of something she could not name. In that silence, her trembling stopped. Her breathing steadied. Peace, fragile yet real, settled over her like a blanket. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then steadier, washing over the roof like a benediction. Grace stayed on her knees, the flicker of candlelight dancing across her face. She no longer prayed for a miracle. She prayed for strength to stand until it came. And somewhere beyond the storm clouds, in the unseen courtroom of heaven, her case had just been heard. That night, as the rain slowed and the city lights dimmed beneath a heavy Texas fog, sleep finally claimed Grace Alvarez. Exhaustion wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but her soul was still restless, still whispering prayers in the quiet places words could no longer reach. The storm clouds broke open over San Antonio, leaving behind a cool wind that slipped through the half-open window. The curtains swayed softly, brushing against the small wooden cross hanging on the wall. And as Grace drifted deeper into sleep, something changed. The air in the room grew still, the hum of the ceiling fan faded, and her dream began. In her dream, she stood in the middle of an open desert, the kind only found in the heart of Texas. Flat, endless, golden under a sky painted in crimson and violet. The earth beneath her feet was cracked but warm. She wore the same black dress she had worn to the bank, but it was no longer torn or faded. It shimmered faintly, like new cloth. Far in the distance, a wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of church bells. She turned toward the sound, and there, on the horizon, stood a figure in white, walking slowly toward her. The light around him was not blinding, but alive, soft and golden like dawn, breaking through fog. Grace couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could feel was an overwhelming peace that made her knees weak. The figure drew closer. His face was calm, his eyes deep and kind. The air around him glowed with warmth that seemed to dissolve every fear she had carried for months. He stopped only a few steps away, looking at her the way a father looks at a child who has finally come home. "Why do you weep, Grace?" the voice said, not loud but so clear it seemed to echo from inside her chest. Tears filled her eyes in the dream. "They took my home," she said, her voice breaking. "They erased my husband's promise. I have no lawyer, no proof, nothing left." The man in white, Jesus Christ, looked at her with infinite tenderness. "You have me," he said, "and I am enough." The ground around them shimmered, and she saw before her a great seal, like the emblem of the state of Texas. But instead of the lone star, it bore a shining cross of light. The words around it read, "In God we trust." Justice is mine. Grace fell to her knees, trembling. Lord, what will happen to us? Fear not, he said. I will stand with you in the court of men. When they speak lies, I will speak truth. When they bring documents, I will bring light. Just keep your faith and let no bitterness enter your heart. As he spoke, a gentle wind lifted the dust around them, swirling into the shape of an open book. On its pages, she saw her husband's signature, Alberto Alvarez, dated May 15th, the very proof she had lost. It glowed for a moment, then dissolved into light. What was stolen will be returned, Jesus said, not because of the paper, but because of the promise. The truth cannot be deleted when it is written in heaven. Grace tried to reach for him, but her hand passed through the light. His final words drifted on the wind. Stand firm. I am with you. Then the sky brightened, and she awoke. The first light of dawn poured through her window, warm and golden, the same hue that had filled her dream. The rain had stopped, and the world outside glistened as if freshly washed clean. Grace sat up slowly, her heart pounding, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. The clock read 6:33 a.m. On the kitchen table below, her open Bible lay at the verse she'd prayed over the night before. He will defend the cause of the widow. Grace pressed her hand to her chest. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, not because her problems were gone, but because she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The God of Texas skies had spoken, and his promise was clear. The judge of heaven was about to enter her case. The courthouse in downtown San Antonio buzzed with low murmurs that Monday morning. The Texas flag swayed slowly above the marble steps as people filed in, lawyers, clerks, reporters, and the curious few who came to witness another routine foreclosure case. But for Grace Alvarez, this was not routine. It was her life on trial. She stood outside courtroom 7, clutching her folder of faded documents, her heart pounding beneath her black dress. Michael and Ellie sat quietly beside her, their eyes wide with worry. He tried to be strong, but his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. Ellie held a small wooden cross in her pocket, the same one that had hung in their kitchen for years. When the bailiff finally called, "Case number 22-0413, Lone Star Central Bank versus Grace Alvarez," the sound echoed like a verdict before the trial even began. Inside, the room was a cathedral of law, mahogany benches, tall windows, and an American flag hanging behind the judge's bench. Judge Raymond Archer, gray-haired and dignified, adjusted his glasses as he took his seat. Known for his discipline and zero tolerance for emotion in the courtroom, he scanned the room with the same expression he wore at every case: calm, detached, and unshakable. To his left, the bank's legal team sat in crisp suits. Martin Vale, CEO of Lone Star Central Bank, leaned back in his chair with the quiet confidence of a man who never lost. Next to him, attorney Daniel Shaw opened a leather briefcase filled with files, tabs, and exhibits, ready to bury Grace under procedure and paperwork. They whispered to each other, smirking. Grace took her seat alone at the defense table. Her folder looked almost laughably thin next to the tower of evidence across the aisle. She had no lawyer, no witnesses, only her faith, but in her heart still echoed the words from her dream. I will stand with you in the court of men. The bailiff called, "All rise." The entire room stood as Judge Archer entered. His gavel struck once. You may be seated. Attorney Shaw rose. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. The defendant failed to fulfill her mortgage obligations. The bank seeks lawful repossession of the property. He moved methodically, clicking through slides projected on a screen, payment charts, timolines, scanned contracts. Each click felt like a nail being hammered into Grace's hope. Mrs. Alvarez, the judge said, do you have an attorney representing you today? Grace stood slowly. No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself. A faint murmur rippled through the audience. The judge nodded. Very well. You may proceed when it's your turn. As Shaw continued, he glanced toward Grace. We sympathize with her situation, he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. But the law is the law. Emotion cannot override evidence. Martin Vale smirked at those words, watching her crumble in silence. To him, it was already over. When it was finally her turn, Grace rose, clutching her folder like armor. Your Honor, she began softly. My husband Alberto worked 30 years for that home. He paid every bill, every loan, and before he passed, he completed the last payment. The receipt was real. I saw it with my own eyes. But now, it's gone. Maybe it was lost. Maybe it was erased. But I know what I saw. Shaw interrupted. Your Honor, she's making emotional claims without evidence. Overruled, the judge said unexpectedly. She has the floor. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice grew steadier. I can't show you the paper, sir, but I can tell you the truth. I came here alone because I believe in justice, not the kind written by men, but the kind that lives in heaven. And I know I'm not alone today. A hush fell over the room. Even Shaw's hand froze above his notes. Judge Archer shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed. For the first time in his long career, he felt something he couldn't explain, a quiet pressure in his chest, like an invisible gaze watching him from above. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Alvarez, please remain seated. We will take a short recess. The gavel struck once more. As the room emptied, whispers filled the hallway. Who is she? Why would a woman stand alone against a bank? But in the stillness of her heart, Grace already knew. The next battle in that courtroom wouldn't just be about law and money, it would be about truth itself. And she was no longer the only one fighting. The courtroom was silent except for the soft click of the ceiling fan and the restless turning of legal pages. Grace Alvarez stood trembling at the defense table, her fingers pressed against the worn edge of her folder. Across from her, Attorney Daniel Shaw paced slowly, voice calm but sharp as a blade. Mrs. Alvarez, he said, you admit you cannot produce any proof of the alleged payment, correct? Yes, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Then on what basis? Shaw continued. Do you expect this court to disregard documented financial records, certified by Lone Star Central Bank, and rule in your favor? The words stung. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, waiting for her to crumble. Grace looked down at her empty folder, the folder that once held her husband's final receipt, his final promise. The silence stretched thin. Judge Raymond Archer adjusted his glasses, watching her carefully. Mrs. Alvarez, he said, tone neutral. If you have nothing further to present, the court must rely on evidence. Do you understand? Grace swallowed hard. I understand, Your Honor, but something inside her, something deeper than fear, began to rise. Slowly, she turned her eyes toward the small brass cross engraved on the courtroom wall, just above the flag. For a moment, she heard again the voice from her dream. When they speak lies, I will speak truth. Her knees buckled slightly. She took a deep breath, stepped away from the defense table, and moved to the center of the courtroom floor. Gasps rippled through the room as she set her folder down, clasped her trembling hands, and without warning fell to her knees. Mrs. Alvarez, the judge began, startled. What are you doing? Grace lifted her tear-streaked face toward the ceiling. Her voice was soft at first, but it grew with each word. Lord Jesus Christ, she said, I have no lawyer, no witness, and no power. But you see me. You were there when my husband paid. You were there when the paper disappeared. If no one here believes me, please be my lawyer in heaven. The courtroom froze. A clerk dropped his pen. A reporter in the back lowered her camera. Even Martin Vale, the bank's CEO, stopped checking his watch. Grace's words echoed off the high ceiling. If I have no proof that men can read, write your truth where no one can erase it. If I stand alone, stand beside me. If they mock my faith, let them see your justice. Her voice cracked on the last sentence. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks, pooling on the polished wood floor. She wasn't pleading for money or property anymore. She was pleading for truth itself. Michael stood in the back row, fists clenched, his throat tight. He wanted to run to her, but something told him not to move. Ellie was already crying, whispering under her breath, Help her, Jesus, please help her. Judge Archer sat frozen, his gavel suspended in midair. For 30 years, he had presided over cases of fraud, greed, and perjury. He had heard thousands of voices, seen countless tears, but none had pierced him like this. His chest tightened. Something unseen pressed against his heart, as if someone whispered directly to his soul. I'm her lawyer. The words were not spoken aloud, yet they filled the room like thunder. The judge's hand trembled. He set the gavel down slowly. The courtroom clock ticked once, then again. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Court will take a 30-minute recess," he said, his voice unsteady. "Mrs. Alvarez, you may remain seated." The bailiff hesitated, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Your Honor, do you mean—" "I said recess," Archer repeated. His tone left no room for argument. Grace bowed her head, whispering one last time, "Thank you, Jesus." As people shuffled out, whispers filled the hallway. "Did you hear that?" She prayed in the middle of a trial. Something changed in that room. In the judge's chambers, Archer closed the door behind him and leaned against his desk, his breathing uneven. The sound still echoed inside him, calm, certain, undeniable. "I'm her lawyer." He pressed his hands to his face, shaken to the core. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady against the courthouse windows. Back in the courtroom, Grace remained kneeling on the floor, her tears drying slowly. She didn't know what the judge had heard. She didn't need to. For the first time in months, peace filled her heart. The case was no longer just hers, he had taken it. And somewhere beyond the gray Texas sky, the courtroom of heaven had just declared, "The defense has begun." The courtroom emptied slowly, the echo of Grace's prayer still lingering in the air. Outside, the rain came harder now, drumming against the windows like 1,000 tiny witnesses. Inside Judge Raymond Archer's chambers, the lights flickered once, then steadied. He loosened his tie and sat at his desk, staring at the mountain of files before him. But his mind wasn't on the papers, it was on the voice he had just heard. "I'm her lawyer," he tried to reason with himself. Fatigue, stress, maybe you imagined it, but the words hadn't come from within. They had entered his soul like a command. And with them came a strange peace, mixed with an urgency he couldn't explain. He turned toward his computer, intending to review the bank's submitted documents one more time. The screen was dark. He hadn't touched it yet. Then, without warning, the monitor blinked awake. Lines of code flashed across the screen, green against black, scrolling too fast to read. The judge frowned and reached for the mouse, but it moved on its own. The cursor glided toward the case file directory and clicked open the folder labeled Lone Star Bank v. Alvarez. Every file was there. Payment ledgers, scanned contracts, transaction histories, all exactly as he remembered. Except now, there was something new. A single document at the bottom of the list. Final payment, Alvarez, PDF. His breath caught. He hadn't seen that file before. The timestamp read the 15th of May, 2029, 47 p.m. The same date Grace had mentioned. He hesitated. His hand hovered over the mouse. It's impossible, he thought. The file directory was read-only. Even clerks couldn't add to it once sealed for court review. And yet, here it was, fresh, glowing, waiting. When he opened it, the screen filled with an image. A scanned document, crisp and clear. Across the top was the official Lone Star Central Bank header. Beneath it, in typed text, the words "Mortgage account closed, paid in full." The file bore Alberto Alvarez's signature, and below that, the authorized signature of Ernest Ramirez, the bank's account officer. The page even carried the digital watermark of the bank's seal. Judge Archer leaned closer. His pulse quickened. Every mark, every date, every figure aligned perfectly with the prior transactions. The authenticity was flawless. He picked up the phone on his desk and called for the clerk. "James, come here a moment." A minute later, the young man appeared, slightly out of breath. "Yes, Your Honor?" "Pull up the Alvarez case on your system," Archer said. "Do you see a document titled Final Payment, Alvarez, PDF?" James frowned and clicked rapidly on his tablet. "No, sir, it's not here." "Are you sure?" "It's on my screen," Archer said quietly. James leaned over, eyes widening. That file shouldn't exist. This directory was locked 2 weeks ago. Nobody can add or edit anything without. He stopped mid-sentence as the office lights flickered again. The judge whispered, "Run a print copy." The printer in the corner stirred to life. The sound of the machine whirring and spitting out paper filled the room, sharp and rhythmic. The moment the page came out, Archer reached for it. The ink was still warm. He held it up against the light. The signatures shimmered faintly, as if freshly signed. James swallowed hard. "Sir, what do we do?" Archer stared at the document for a long moment before answering. "We verify it." Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, Ernest Ramirez, The bank officer who had processed the Alvarez loan years ago sat nervously in his car. His phone buzzed a call from the judge's clerk, summoning him back to testify. Sweat gathered on his forehead. He'd tried to forget that account. He'd been ordered to delete the digital proof by Martin Vale himself, and now, somehow, it had reappeared. He whispered to himself, "No one could have recovered that file. I wiped the entire archive." But deep down, he knew what this meant. Someone higher than the bank had intervened. Back in the chambers, Judge Archer placed the printed page on his desk, smoothed it out, and stared at the seal one last time. "Paid in full," he murmured, almost reverently. The rain outside eased into a slow, steady drizzle. The clock on the wall ticked exactly once, as if marking the end of one trial and the beginning of another. For the first time in his career, the judge realized that justice had entered his courtroom, not through law, but through miracle. And as the printer cooled and the last drop of rain slid down the window, he whispered what he now knew to be true. "Her lawyer has spoken." When the court reconvened after recess, the air in courtroom 7 felt charged, as if the very walls had been holding their breath. The storm outside had passed, but the tension inside was electric. Judge Raymond Archer sat solemnly at his bench, the mysterious printout folded neatly before him. His expression was unreadable, part disbelief, part quiet awe. Grace sat silently at the defense table, unaware of what had just unfolded behind closed doors. Her hands were still clasped together in prayer. Across from her, Martin Vale leaned back in his chair, smug and certain, while attorney Daniel Shaw shuffled his papers, ready to deliver the final blow. The bailiff called the court to order. "All rise." Everyone stood as the judge entered, his black robe flowing behind him. But this time, his steps were slower, heavier. He sat down, tapped his pen twice against the desk, and cleared his throat. "Before we proceed," he said, "I have received new evidence that must be reviewed." A murmur rippled through the room. Shaw frowned. "New evidence, Your Honor? From whom?" The judge's eyes narrowed. "That is not your concern at the moment, Counselor. Please call Ernest Ramirez, former account officer of Lone Star Central Bank, to the stand." The name hit the room like a stone dropped in water. Martin Vale stiffened. Ramirez, pale, sweating, rose from the back row and walked to the witness stand, avoiding Vale's gaze. The bailiff swore him in, and he sat down, hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Ramirez," the judge began, "do you recognize this document?" He held up the printed page, the one that had appeared from nowhere. Ramirez's eyes widened. He blinked twice before answering. Yes, Your Honor. That's the final payment confirmation for Alberto Alvarez. I signed it myself 3 years ago. And yet," the judge continued, "this document was not in the bank's submitted records, nor in the foreclosure file, correct?" Ramirez swallowed hard. "No, sir, it wasn't. It was deleted." The room erupted in whispers. Shaw jumped to his feet. "Objection! Hearsay!" "Overruled," said Archer sharply. "Mr. Ramirez, by whom was it deleted?" Ramirez hesitated, glancing at Vale, who sat frozen, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Ramirez whispered, "By order of Martin Vale. He told me to remove all digital traces of the final payment to reclaim the property for the bank's new development fund." The courtroom gasped. Vale slammed his hand on the table. "That's a lie!" he shouted. "I never—" "Enough!" Archer's gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. "Mr. Vale, you will remain silent." He turned back to the witness. "Mr. Ramirez, are you willing to sign a sworn statement to that effect?" Ramirez nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. I've lived with the guilt long enough." The judge exhaled deeply. He turned his gaze to Grace. "Mrs. Alvarez, please stand." Grace rose, trembling, unsure of what was happening. "By the power vested in this court," Archer said, voice steady but soft, "I hereby rule that the mortgage on your home was paid in full prior to your husband's death. The foreclosure order is null and void. The court further finds sufficient evidence to pursue criminal investigation against Martin Vale and associated parties for fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice." The gavel struck again. "Case dismissed." The sound was final, like the closing of a heavy door between darkness and light. Grace covered her mouth with both hands as tears poured freely down her face. Ellie ran forward, wrapping her arms around her mother. Michael followed, lifting her off the ground in a trembling embrace. Across the aisle, Martin Vale sank back into his chair, his power stripped away. The reporters already whispered, phones buzzing with headlines. Bank CEO under investigation. Widow's faith sparks miracle in Texas court. Judge Archer removed his glasses, pressing his temples. He looked out across the room at the family crying, at the stunned crowd, and whispered under his breath, "Justice is no longer blind. It's been touched by heaven." As the courtroom emptied, Grace remained kneeling for a moment, right where she had prayed hours earlier. Her whispered words returned to her like a gentle echo. "Jesus, be my lawyer." And somehow, in the stillness that followed, she knew he had been. The story of the widow who won against the bank spread through Texas faster than wildfire under a dry sky. By sundown, it was everywhere: local news, talk radio, church bulletins. But what struck people most wasn't the legal drama. It was the unexplainable detail, a document that appeared out of nowhere, a judge who heard a voice, and a woman who said without hesitation, "Jesus Christ was my lawyer." Within a week, letters began pouring into Grace Alvarez's small mailbox. Some came from widows, others from veterans, single mothers, even attorneys who admitted they'd lost faith in their own profession. Each one said the same thing: "Your story gave me hope." Grace would sit on her porch every evening, reading them under the fading orange light, her children beside her. Michael, now 16, had started talking about becoming a lawyer who fights for people who can't afford one. Ellie was helping at their church, organizing prayer meetings. Their lives, once marked by survival, were now pulsing with new purpose. But Grace couldn't shake one thought: how many others are still fighting alone? One afternoon, Judge Raymond Archer appeared at her doorstep. No robe this time, just a man humbled by what he'd witnessed. He carried a small envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said softly, "I've seen many cases, but none like yours. What happened in that courtroom changed me. I don't know how to explain it, but I know it wasn't just about one house." Grace nodded. "No, it wasn't." The judge placed the envelope on her table. Inside was a check, the compensation the court had ordered the bank to pay, $100,000. Grace stared at it for a long time. "This is more money than I've ever had," she whispered. Archer smiled gently. "Then maybe it's time to decide what it's for." That night, Grace didn't sleep. She prayed instead. The wind rustled through the pecan trees outside, and the glow from her small altar lit the room in soft gold. "Lord," she said, "you gave me victory I didn't earn. Tell me what you want me to do with it." The next morning, she had her answer. Within a month, the Divine Advocate Fund was born, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families facing wrongful foreclosures, eviction, or injustice without the means to defend themselves. Its mission was simple: to give every person what Grace Alvarez once prayed for: a defender. Local lawyers began volunteering their time. Churches across Texas raised donations. Reporters who had covered the case returned to document this new chapter. A woman who turned her miracle into a movement. The first client was a grandmother from Houston, wrongfully evicted after a clerical error. The fund's volunteers took her case pro bono. Weeks later, she won and cried in court, just like Grace had. "Jesus sent you," the woman told her. Grace only smiled. "He sent all of us." Soon, the Divine Advocate Fund opened offices in 3 cities. Former Judge Archer joined as an advisor, quietly funding legal education programs for underprivileged youth. Ernest Ramirez, the banker who confessed in court, became one of the fund's coordinators, helping track down fraudulent foreclosure cases. Reporters often asked Grace what made her start it all. She always gave the same answer: "Because one day, heaven defended me. Now I want to be his hands and feet for others." At a dedication ceremony, standing in front of a banner that read, "Justice, Mercy, and Truth," she addressed a small crowd of volunteers. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with conviction. "The Divine Advocate Fund isn't just about law," she said. "It's about reminding people that God still fights for them through us. We're not the lawyers. He is. We just carry his briefcase." Applause filled the room. But it was more than applause, it was an awakening. People left that night not just inspired, but recommissioned. Months later, when the fund reached its 100th case, Grace visited the courthouse again, the same one where she had once fallen to her knees. On the marble steps stood a new bronze plaque, commissioned anonymously. It read, "In this court, on a rainy Friday in October, a widow prayed." Grace touched the plaque, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "And now, Lord, let me keep working for you." The sun broke through the Texas clouds just then, and she smiled not as a woman who had won her case, but as one who had discovered her calling. 10 years passed. The Alvarez home in San Marcos, Texas, once the symbol of a widow's struggle, had become something more, a monument to divine justice. Roses bloomed around the porch now, and every summer a small brass plaque caught the sunlight near the door. It read simply, "When Jesus is your lawyer, you've already won." Grace Alvarez, now 68, no longer worked as a seamstress. Her days were filled with letters, meetings, and prayers. The Divine Advocate Fund, which she had started with her court compensation, had grown beyond her imagination. From one small room in a church basement, it had expanded into 12 offices across 5 states, providing free legal aid to widows, veterans, and families facing wrongful foreclosures. The fund had already defended more than 1,000 families, each one a story of faith meeting justice. But what began as a miracle of one woman was about to become a movement that would change the entire nation. It started with a single invitation from Washington, D.C. The U.S. Senate Committee on Housing and Urban Development requested Grace to testify about predatory foreclosure practices and the need for reform. She hesitated at first. "I'm not a lawyer," she said, but Judge Raymond Archer, now retired and serving as an advisor to the fund, told her gently, "That's exactly why they need to hear from you." A week later, she stood in the grand marble hearing room of the Capitol, her hands shaking slightly as she placed her notes on the podium. The senators leaned in. The cameras rolled. 10 years ago, she began, "I was just a widow in a small Texas town, standing alone in court against a powerful bank. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have proof. But I had Jesus Christ, and he became my advocate." The room fell silent. I watched documents appear when all evidence was gone. I watched truth rise when lies had all the power. That day, I learned something that changed my life. When the laws of men fail, the laws of heaven still stand. But we can do better. We can make sure that no family ever has to pray for a miracle just to get basic justice. For the next 40 minutes, she told her story not with theatrics, but with conviction. She shared statistics, testimonies from families helped by the fund, and her vision for a new piece of legislation. The GRACE Act, short for Guaranteed Representation and Accountability in Civil Equity. And lever lead to is this WERN. The bill aimed to provide free legal defense for low-income homeowners facing foreclosure, establish stricter transparency requirements for banks, and create a national database to prevent fraudulent mortgage manipulation. When she finished, the room was still. Then Senator Whitaker from Texas leaned forward, visibly moved. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said, "your faith started something divine. Let's make sure it becomes law." 3 months later, the GRACE Act passed the House. 6 months after that, it cleared the Senate with bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity in a divided country. The signing took place on the south lawn of the White House, under a bright April sun. The president handed Grace the ceremonial pen and said, "You didn't just change the law, Mrs. Alvarez. You changed the meaning of justice." Behind her stood families, once helped by her foundation, including widows, single parents, veterans, and Judge Archer himself. Reporters captured her smile as she lifted the pen slightly toward the sky. "This isn't my doing," she said softly to the cameras. "This belongs to the one who defended me when no one else would." The story ran on every major network that evening. The GRACE Act becomes law, inspired by faith and justice. But what truly captured America's heart wasn't the politics. It was the footage of a humble woman kneeling on the courthouse floor years earlier, whispering, "Jesus, be my lawyer." Her prayer had become policy. Years later, law schools across the country began teaching the GRACE Act as a landmark in faith-based civic reform. And each case helped under its provisions carried the same quiet reminder that justice, when guided by mercy, still bore the fingerprints of heaven. On her 70th birthday, surrounded by her grown children and grandchildren, Grace smiled as she watched a young attorney on television say, "Because of the GRACE Act, no widow stands alone anymore." Outside, the Texas wind stirred softly through the garden. The brass plaque by the porch caught the sun once more, glowing like a promise fulfilled. When Jesus Christ defends a soul, the case doesn't end in court. It becomes a legacy. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Stories of Grace, where true faith meets real miracles. Join our growing community and help us share hope, one story at a time.